Namaskar, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha. You're watching our special series in the run-up to the Union Budget, where we look at the performance and expectations of different sectors. We've covered the manufacturing sector and also looked at the job scenario in our previous episodes. Today, we will be talking about trade and commerce. So looking at the exports and imports numbers first. In December 2021, India's exports surged 37% on an annual basis to over 37 billion US dollars, the highest ever monthly figure. Imports too rose by 38% to $59.27 billion on account of an increase in oil imports, which soared 65.17% to 15.9 billion US dollars. In December 2020, exports stood at $27.22 billion, while imports aggregated to $42.93 billion. And due to robust exports and manufacturing activity, India regained the top position on the emerging markets, the EM League table, for the second straight month in December 2021. However, despite the resilience and robustness that has helped in the recovery of the economy, the challenge now going forward is to sustain the momentum and address various concerns, ranging from extension of government support to new policy measures, problems arising out of logistics, changes in duty structure, etc. So in the run-up to the budget, what are these concerns and hopes to boost trade and commerce, as well as sustain positive growth in the next financial year and beyond, is what we will look at on this edition of Budget Special. Joining me are three distinguished panelists who will be discussing these aspects and much more with me on the program. So let me first introduce them to you. I have with me Mr. Brajendra Navneet, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of India, WTO. Mr. Rajiv Kher, former Commerce Secretary, Government of India. And Mr. Sanjay Agarwal, immediate past President, PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on this edition of our Budget Special program on Sansad TV. So before we get specifically into different sectors contributing to trade and commerce, Mr. Kher, allow me to begin the program with you. Your thoughts on the expectations, the hopes for this sector from the upcoming budget.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tina, for having me on this program. Expectations in India, normally people start expecting too much from the budget. And I will not deny that people would be looking for the similar kind of response from the budget. But let me at the outset say that many things in the trade realm have to be addressed outside the budget. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we should be very clear that we should not expect everything coming out of the budget. But since you are asking me this question, in my view, two most important things that we need to address are the three. One, we need to do some optimization, some rationalization in the area of tariffs. On the one hand, we have started a strong production subsidy program. And on the other hand, we have increased tariffs of inputs in many areas. I think there is a strong rationalization which is overdue. Two, we have started a very ambitious infrastructure project, Gati Shakti. I think it is important that we specifically look at trade-related infrastructure and logistics, because unless these two areas are addressed, the ease of doing business, which we have worked so much upon, will not facilitate into good trade, into reliable, satisfactory trade figures. And thirdly, we need to do a lot of work in the area of trade facilitation. So I think these three broad areas, as you would have seen, everything doesn't have to be answered through budget. Absolutely. A lot can be answered even outside the budget.
Okay, so how much of it actually fructifies when the finance minister presents the budget is something we'll have to wait and watch. But Mr. Agarwal, what are the kind of expectations from the trade associations, the industry? There are three broad pointers that Mr. Kher has pointed out. In addition to that, going forth, what do you hope from the budget?
As Mr. Kher very rightly said, you see, budget is only one part of an ongoing exercise throughout the year in which so many things need to be done, and they are in most cases being done. But yes, budget being the time for the trade and industry to be able to more, you know, to come out with our views and to put up our expectations. So I think that's what one should be talking about. I totally agree with the three broad points that Mr. Kher has talked about: tariff rationalization, the stress on logistics, and the trade facilitation. These all three are very important. And let me just add a few more points of my own. Uh, Tariff rationalization, I would like to add another angle to it, which is that during the last 1 year, the prices of most of the primary products and commodities have gone up by more than 50 to 150%, which means that our primary producers are all making extremely good profits, which is very good for them. At the same time, what is happening is that the higher protection that they have enjoyed in the past has now come up to haunt the downstream sectors. The downstream sectors are also paying on top, even if they buy from domestically, they are ending up paying the customs duty that is imposed via the tariff means on whatever they consume. So the high commodity prices have to be addressed by means of reviewing the tariffs, at least on those items where there has been an international price increase of more than 50%. That is something that the PSD chamber has been, which I am a former president, has been demanding very strongly. And we feel that the downstream sectors are the ones who are actually going to provide the employment and a great chunk of GDP also. The primary producer, for whatever he loses out on the Indian market, he is happy to export because the international prices are pretty high right now. So I guess the tariff lines have to be a bit more responsive to the current market situations. That is one part. Coming to the other part, of course, of the Gati Shakti, I think that 100 lakh crore, we would very much encourage the government to actually come out with solid expenditure on the ground. Because, what is happening is, whether it is the National Infrastructure Pipeline for 100 lakh crores, which was announced in December, 31st December 2019, or the Gati Shakti scheme, we actually are yet to see some major money flowing into infrastructure projects, into the logistics projects. Unfortunately, we still remain stuck at 13 to 14% logistic cost of our exports or whatever we produce, compared to 8% maybe for China and 6 to 7% for the advanced economies. So Gati Shakti is definitely the panacea for us to reach those internationally competitive levels, but then we need the expenditure for that.
Coming to you, Mr. Navneet, and sort of look back at how the Indian economy has performed, the role of trade, particularly in our recovery process. And one very interesting observation is that, when the COVID pandemic hit, there was apprehension that there would be a sharp decline in foreign trade. Of course, now that has turned out to be negative for India. But for the benefit of our viewers, if you could cite what have been the major factors which have actually helped India pose this kind of recovery, which was faster and much better than what was anticipated.
Thank you, Tina, first of all, for having me on this show. And good afternoon, good evening, because we are in different time zones. So first, to answer on what has helped actually India to recover fast, it had a lot of background in the sense of the work done in past 4, 5, 6 years on macroeconomic aspects, whether it was linked to logistics, whether it was linked to incentives for phased manufacturing plan or production linked incentive, or whether it was linked to being a reliable supply partner during COVID pandemic, both on the goods side as well as services side. All these things actually helped India to demonstrate that India can emerge as a reliable global supply partner, because everyone was talking about supply chain resilience. We always hear that we need to find opportunities from the challenges, and certainly 2021 was full of challenges for the entire world. And in trade terms, Tina, it is a historic year for us, because for the first time in the calendar year as well as in the financial year 21-22, we are going to touch or may even cross 400 billion US dollars for the goods trade, and we will be touching not less than $225 billion of services trade. So what we are talking about is $625 to $650 billion of India's export to the globe during a pandemic year.
Absolutely. Mr. Kher, do you also agree that, this crisis has actually come as a blessing in disguise for us? It has taught India how to reimagine world trade, and our recovery, our numbers actually indicate towards that.
Yeah, I agree with Brijein that we have done remarkably well in exports, but we need to go behind these numbers. There is no doubt that we are going to break our earlier records. We need to analyze the reasons for such good performance. Besides the fact that government has laid a lot of emphasis on increasing exports, it is also a fact that commodity prices and input prices have gone up. And to that extent, they would be reflecting in our exports as well. So that is one aspect. Mm-hmm. The second aspect is that because of the pandemic's after effect, there is a huge amount of pent-up demand which is now being responded to. And thirdly, in the area of digital commerce, we would be doing far better than what we have done in the past for obvious reasons. So we need to bring in these three reasons, plus the fact that there has been an impetus to export, and therefore we have done remarkably well. But this also then, in sense, gives us a reason to build up on this edifice and build up a significant leap on our export performance.
Absolutely. And how we are going to do that is something that I'll come back to and understand. But in the meanwhile, coming back to you, Mr. Navneet, you mentioned how India's share of global merchandise exports is currently at an all-time high, and we are close to achieving the $400 billion mark as well. What is it that is driving growth of merchandise exports, particularly if you look at?
If you look at on the components of it, we have done pretty well in our conventional sector. Mm-hmm. And then there are new emerging sectors on which we have done pretty well. So take, for example, which is not a conventional sector for India, that is electronic goods. Now, world trade of about 25 to 28 trillion dollars, what is being projected, almost 30% of that comes from the electronic goods sector. And we were actually not a good player or significant player into that. But due to the policy followed in the last 3-4 years, this year you will see that we already had exports to the tune of $16 to $17 billion, which used to be, if Rajiv Kher sir will bear me out, it used to be $2 to $3 billion. And we were a significant net importers. In fact, there was a threat that electronic goods are going to become a new crude for India, because it was growing, that deficit in trade was growing year on year on 20% basis. So this is one sector on which we have done pretty well based on the policy interventions. Mm-hmm. The second one, if I may bring in, is the agriculture sector. Like this year, we are going to hit, most likely, though it may create some ripples at the WTO here in Geneva, but we are going to hit $50 billion of export in agriculture sector. And in the same manner, if we see textiles and if we see the conventional pharmaceutical sectors, we have done pretty well during this year. So we have a mix of both conventional, which we are known for historically exporting those, and then we have new sectors. One thing I must not miss is on the capital goods side, that engineering and our heavy production thing, because it has backward forward linkage with the world. It has done fantastic during the pandemic. So that shows that we are integrated to the supply chain, because the capital goods cannot be exported without having backward forward integration.
Yes.
So these are some of the examples which I can share, that both due to policy interventions and the resilience of the private sector in India has helped us in moving forward.
Okay, Mr. Agarwal, but the concern remains on the trade imbalance front, because alongside the exports, the imports are also showing a positive growth, and this is where the concern lies. So what can be done in the times to come to sustain the positive growth that we have seen in terms of exports in the coming financial year as well as beyond, and to also sort of control the trade imbalance to address this problem?
You see, in the times to come, what we need to do as a nation is to look at not just exports, but the breakup of exports. And we have to supply or export more and more of manufactured goods. That is one reason why I think the government has very rightly invested its huge amount of 1.94 lakh crores into the PLI scheme. Electronics is going to be a good, large beneficiary of this. And we hope sincerely that the PLI scheme is able to get us that target of 3 fabs that we want to make semiconductor chips in India. Now, when we do all that, we will be having some real products which are not just import-based. You know, as Kher Saab very rightly pointed out, if the commodity prices have increased, so if that is contributing to our increase in export value, but that's also getting a corresponding increase in import value. We are just adding a bit of value to that. So now what we need to ensure is that the downstream sectors which provide the maximum value add and the maximum employment to the economy, they are encouraged. And for that, I think PLI scheme is going to do wonders. Mm-hmm. In addition, we have to appreciate that there is a tectonic change in the way the Western markets, which have also been traditionally our major export markets, has, one thing I would like to mention is there are going to be a large number of new products which did not seem to be large part of our export portfolio earlier, but now will become the good-sized exports simply because America and the West has been totally dependent on China for many of those products where India could not simply compete in the past. Now, there is a very conscious move on behalf of the buyers, but not just a conscious move, but there are punitive customs duties also in the US and in other Western economies, due to which Chinese products are becoming uncompetitive. And there is going to be a serious move towards other countries, and India is very well placed to take advantage of that situation. But again, it's not going to be easy. What I would like to request Mr. Brajendranath Navneet to actually, help us with is to make sure that all these 7-8, free trade agreements that we are in the process of discussing with various markets are, fructified as fast as possible. And in the US, for the US, actually, we have not entered into any formal FTA discussion as yet. But even there, if we are able to somehow convince them to at least remove the GSP barrier, we have been taken off the generalized system of preferences list, which is causing customs duties to be imposed on our products. And this is one thing, if we are able to impress upon our US trade partners to relook, this GSP removal has happened very recently, I think only 2 years back. So if we can work on that, that can provide a long-term fillip to us, because we are now being seen as a reliable trade partner. These countries do not want to depend upon China for at least, all their imports. And that is an opportunity which, in terms of both trade facilitation, in terms of tariffs, in terms of how we can deal with these markets, in terms of free trade agreements and all of that combined together could easily help us to, increase our exports manifold, absolutely manifold. We could go up to 800 billion in no time, provided we are able to encash this opportunity fully. That's
absolutely, absolutely. So before I go on and ask Mr. Navneet to respond, Mr. Agarwal, another concern, since you mentioned the free trade agreements, we are in the process of entering free trade agreements with several countries. There are regional trade agreements as well. So on one hand, while they help boost trade and commerce, do they also not require our domestic industry to brace for increased competition? How prepared are we? Because if we get into making FTAs realistic and compliant as per the WTO norms, and Mr. Navneet will be able to shed more light on what are the requirements to do so, 90% of the trade will need to be covered under substantial liberalization. So how are we prepared to meet all of that?
Okay. I think let me just clarify here on this. Mm-hmm. What happens is that most of the smaller industries, the MSMEs or the downstream industries, do not either have the muscle or even the intellectual muscle to, go into the details of the fine prints and to be actually actively do some lobbying for their products to be here or there. What really results is, and this is what the government, I would say, needs to be very careful about, it's ultimately the large sectors, the primary sectors, which end up getting more and more protection. And so practically what happens is that in these sort of discussions, the smaller MSME products, wherever there is a majority of MSME producers, those are the ones which get traded away. And similar things have happened in so many products in our earlier FTAs that we had, for example, with the ASEAN. Lots of products came into our country on a duty-free basis, and the inputs for those products were imported at a very high price by the Indian manufacturers who got out of business. So if there is, we have to always look at the fact that we do not cause an inverted duty structure. Free trade agreements should not mean an inverted duty structure for the downstream sectors. That is something I would request the government to be very, very careful about. The larger players, they are strong enough, they are having enough muscle to lobby and to convince the government. And the other guys, they are not simply organized enough to be able to have their voices heard. That causes these the distortions. But as a trade industry, I would be very, very happy to be competing in a free and fair market. Absolutely.
Okay.
No
But changes in inverted duty structure, Mr. Kher, how feasible is that? Is there scope for, can we expect that in the budget?
Yes, very much. In fact, earlier budgets have addressed this issue in different ways. And I think Mr. Agarwal is raising a very valid point. There are two issues, particularly in the context of tariffs. And when we look at tariff, we also have to look at one very important aspect. Today, and this is the centerpiece of and everything that we do about trade policy. The first thing is that we need to recognize that unless India onboards global value chains, the prospects of meeting those targets, which we keep talking to ourselves, will be very minimally attained. And joining global value chains, tariffs play a major role. As you know, production systems happen over a cascade. We import certain inputs, we add value to those inputs, and then we export them. Therefore, if we have higher tariffs on inputs, then the tariff adds to the cost, and thereby we export a product which turns into uncompetitive vis-a-vis our competitors. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is what Mr. Agarwal is pointing out. Sometimes inputs will have more tariff, while the output will have smaller tariff. So you have a finished product coming in from another country, where you are trying to manufacture a product, but because the tariff is high, you become uncompetitive. So both these aspects have to be rationalized. And unless these aspects are rationalized, we will not be able to board those value chains and become globally competitive. What tends to happen is, if you increase the input tariff, then you tend to become inward-looking. And therefore, anyone who invests in your country in that scale, that industry or that product area tends to look at the domestic market alone and not the global market. And unless you look at the global market, we will not be in a position to reach those heights which we have ambition to reach. So therefore, tariff rationalization, in my view, as far as the budget is concerned, is the most important thing.
Okay, Mr. Navneet, so are these aspects that have been pointed out by both Mr. Agarwal and Mr. Kher, are we looking into these aspects while negotiating free trade agreements with several countries?
First of all, for inverted duty structure, it is a kind of ongoing exercise, because every budget you will have changes in duty structure, or even during the financial year. So we start, in fact, we remove certain inverted duty structures, and then we create a new ones based on the representation from industries and based from all these agreements. So I think it is always an ongoing exercise. Our emphasis should be to minimize inverted duty structure in our country. But now let me broadly respond on, because a lot of talk is on the duty side, that India in the recent past has increased duty, and which is against conventional wisdom, that we will not be able to grow in export on sustainable basis. So let me counter that for a change, because we have seen what has happened in the past, and we have seen what we have done in last couple of years based on those policy decisions. So first thing is first, that most of the developed countries, they have used tariff as a tool for their domestic industrialization. That is point number one. The second point is that we need to distinguish between export competitiveness and import substitutions. So when we talk of export competitiveness, we don't export our taxes. And thanks to GST and the related automation in the GST system, the time lag between refunds for the customs duties paid on input materials for export has actually reduced. And there we need feedback from industry that what kind of time lag is there and how best we can minimize that. So then we are not exporting the customs duty. You are not loading our exporters with the customs duty. It is only the questions of the working capital for that intervening period, which may be a couple of months or 3 months. Can we reduce it to, let us say, for 15 days or 30 days so that the interest on those locked up capital can be reduced? Now, the third thing is that when we talk about increasing tariff on certain things for import substitutions or value addition in our country, two things we need to keep in our mind, that it should not be a permanent arrangement and it should be only for hand-holding for that period to introduce value addition in the domestic market. And it should not help in supporting inefficiencies of our domestic industries. In past, when we have done that tariff increase, in fact, most of the time these things were used for a longer period, and that resulted in inefficient domestic manufacturing. But I think presently, when we are talking about production-linked incentive or phased manufacturing plan, the tariff duties are designed in such manner that gradually value addition has to increase in India, and subsequently we reduce the tariff which was increased for a temporary period. Now, coming to the questions raised by Mr. Sanjay Agarwal on the potential what we have vis-a-vis China. Certainly, we need to tap that potential. We have already started working on it. And when I talk to the global investors or people who are moving around their manufacturing base and trying to diversify, India is on top of their radar. And not only due to concentration in one place, recently I looked at data that there is a significant reduction in active labor workforce in China because of their population policy, what they have followed. So what we will see in the coming 5-6 years, it is a drop of almost 1/4 to 1/3 of their labor force. And that is very important for us because we have to work on twin track. One, where we have to increase our export competitiveness and connection with the global world on conventional sectors, which are labor intensive. And the second one is on the new sunrising sector, where we don't want to compete and we want to take a leapfrog like we are trying to do in the hydrogen policy. Coming to on GSP issues, I have again a slightly different take on the GSP issues. See, we have lost that GSP benefit for last 3 years, whereas our export, I checked the actual data in the sectors in which or the lines in which we were getting that GSP support. So we have to come out of this mentality that we only can grow only when GSP kind of support is there. In fact, we have done better even without GSP vis-a-vis trade in those line items where we are getting GSP supports. And I think we should compete on efficiency basis and cost effectiveness basis rather than on the GSP support, and leverage that bargain with US rather than on GSP in some other sectors. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Agarwal.
May I just make one small comment to Mr. Ramneet's comment on GSP? Sir, actually, GSP is not, you're very right when you say that it's a support which one probably should not need. But the issue is that US is having so many FTAs with other countries that my competitors, when I go as an exporter from India, unless I have GSP, I am paying duty of 3, 4, 5, 7, 8%, depending on the product that I am exporting, whereas they are getting it duty-free into the US market. So that's where it would help, and maybe you could consider. It's not a question of crutches. It is a question of my competitors having duty-free access.
Absolutely. So these are concerns from the industry, and Mr. Navneet has aptly replied as to what is feasible, what is not, given the circumstances globally. But coming to you, Mr. Kher, to understand another important aspect, which Commerce Secretary Mr. BVR Subramaniam happened to mention a few days ago, and in the run-up to the budget, while speaking at a session of the CII Partnership Summit, he had hinted on the need to actually simplify the SEZ policy. Now, help us and our viewers understand, why is there a need felt to rewrite the SEZ's laws in the country? What are the concerns that have emanated, post which now the government is moving towards this?
Okay, see, special economic zones is something which is used as a tool in many countries for expanding export performance. Now, in India also, we started SEZs at a time when there was a lot of focus on exports. Unfortunately, the SEZ policy got into different kinds of headwinds. There were political headwinds, there were conceptual issues, and as a consequence, despite the fact that some SEZs did very well and are responsible for bringing up our export performance, on the other hand, there were many SEZs which could not do as well. And the whole scheme got into some sort of a controversy. Some years ago, the government constituted a committee which went into reviewing the SEZ policy and has made those recommendations. As far as I understand, those recommendations are awaiting government's response. The limited point which one needs to emphasize is that SEZs essentially mushroomed because of the plethora of tax benefits which were associated with the fact of establishing industries in SEZ areas. And once those exemptions ran out of time, then that attractiveness went away. More importantly, there has been a strong demand from SEZs that they should be allowed to export into the domestic tariff areas.
Yes.
And that is one demand that has been there on the table for a very long time. Now, this is a demand which, in my view, has acquired a certain amount of rationality. The fact is, inputs are imported into SEZ, value is added, and then export is made. Now, the industry is saying that to allow us to export, allow us to sell it in the domestic area, and we are not saying that we will not pay taxes on inputs. They are simply saying that they should not be charged taxes on the value add, which makes eminent sense. So therefore, government needs to look at the specific policy on SEZs being allowed to sell in domestic tariff areas. This could be sectorally oriented, this could be threshold oriented, or whatever conditionalities the government wants to bring in. But I think it will be important for SEZs to acquire that the vibrancy once again. The second thing is that once SEZs went into some sort of a somnolence, they became inactive, many of them, there is huge amount of land which is accumulated in SEZs. And that land needs to be put to appropriate use. Now, the problem is that you cannot disassociate interim chunks of land from a given SEZ, because that will create islands of foreign alien territories, because SEZ is a concept which is considered as an alien territory. And therefore, governance will become extremely important. Therefore, this is a very crucial issue and the government needs to resolve it.
Absolutely.
The third aspect is that there are services which are rendered in SEZs for domestic tariff area related products. And there is this huge controversy going on as to that turns out to be an export to the SEZ territory. And then how do you deal with it once the product comes back? So I think these are some 2 or 3 issues besides many others that require some sort of an addressal. SEZs need to be revived. There was a thought earlier of coastal economic zones. That thought somehow has not made a forward move. We need to recognize that the concept of SEZ has done wonders in many countries which are today at the forefront of exports. You look at China, look at Vietnam, look at many other countries. And therefore, there is a need for us to give a constructive thought to SEZs.
Absolutely. And
But before I give away the floor, Tina, if you allow me, I just want to respond to one point which Brijendra had made, on the tariffs, because it is often misunderstood. You know, this fact that inputs, the taxes paid on inputs are allowed to be remitted by the various processes, various programs. The fact is there is so much of inefficiency in the execution of these programs that the cost doesn't go down. I would recommend a study recently done by the Mobile and Electronic Manufacturers Association. And you would see that it has clearly been brought out that if you compare yourself with other competing countries, the cost involved in this process is so much more, and that makes us lose our competitiveness. So therefore, it is very easy to say that you don't have to pay duties, you get a reimbursement, you get a remission, and so on and so forth. But actually, the efficiency involved in the governance of that program requires a drastic change.
Okay. I'll come back to you, Mr. Navneet, and ask you to respond on what Mr. Kher said. But before that, a quick response on the SEZ policy from Mr. Agarwal. You know, the kind of concerns that have been raised on the SEZ policy, what is also being hinted by the Commerce Secretary, that, you know, if there is a unit in an SEZ facing the domestic market, it will behave like a domestic tariff area entity. And if it is facing the international market, it is going to behave like an SEZ unit. And this is under consideration by the government, which the Commerce Secretary recently hinted at. Now, if this happens, and looking at the assertions that the explanation that Mr. Kher gave on the requirements, the concerns that have been raised over time, how beneficial is it going to be from an industry point of view?
You see, my personal view is that whatever industrial capacity that we create in our country on the basis of a set of promises, on top of that, if we can try and help make it more competitive, and if we are happy to import something, why not buy it from our own unit, which is our own it's our own manufacturing unit, but it's based in India as an SEZ. So why should it be barred, from having the opportunity of selling to its own domestic market? So in principle, the logic is very sound. In practice, there might be certain crinkles which would, of course, need to be checked up. Whoever has any problems with that concept should come out, and then one could say, okay, that this is the solution, and one could look into it. As a matter of principle, the purpose of SEZ is to make to have more competitive Indian manufacturing, which can go out and sell in the international markets. So if it is helped by selling into the Indian market, by not putting the Indian manufacturer at very disadvantage, who is not in the SEZ, then it should not be a problem at all. It should, in fact, be welcome.
Okay. Mr. Navneet, let me come to you for your response on what Mr. Kher said.
First, let me thank Rajiv sir for raising this, because I was expecting this question from you or from other panelists. See, we need to look at two aspects again, I will say. One, we are not like a small exporting nations. The difference between other Southeast Asian countries and India is that we have a large domestic market also. And all of us agree that consumption in India is going to increase. So we will likely to have huge domestic demand in certain sectors. In past, I'm not criticizing, but I'm just stating the fact. In past, when we moved ahead, let us take example for telecommunications and electronic goods sectors. We certainly would have envisaged that we will grow in this sector rapidly for domestic consumptions. But following the conventional tariff policy prescribed by reformers, what we ended up having, totally import-dependent domestic economy in telecommunication as well as electronic goods. And that led to $60 billion worth of import in India. So we always talk about crude, but this $60 billion was hidden over last 10, 15 years. And it was growing at, as I said in the beginning, it was growing at the rate of CAGR 20%. So we must have to have a policy to tackle these kinds of situations when we foresee the demand, that how to incentivize domestic production through FDI regime, through production-linked incentives regime, through tariff as a tool for temporary purpose. So it has to be seen in totality. On refund part of it, there are again two components to it. One is customs duty and another is internal taxes. Now, on internal taxes, I fully agree that yes, historically, we were not able to refund all the embedded taxes at the central and state level. We had different schemes, and we are still doing that. But on the customs side, thanks to what I say, this GST portal and IGST, when I talk to industry, certainly the IGST part is getting refunded now in less than 3 months. And there are exceptional cases and aberrations. So when I last checked, the percentage was 94 to 96% of refunds taking place within 90 days. So yes, we need to sit with industry to streamline the process further. And can we make that 94 to 100%? Can we have some scheme, even why to lock their capital on paying duty for 3 months? Can we have something to give them the carrying cost for those 3 months of the capital in the form of some sort of subvention on the interest side or something like that? So I will still insist that we need to use tariff as a tool for domestic industrialization. We need to use tariff as a tool for value addition in India, but yes, not on permanent basis and not for breeding or creeping in inefficiency in the Indian system. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Moving on to another important component of exports, which has contributed effectively in the year gone by as well. And I'll take that question to you, Mr. Kher. The e-commerce sector, if you look at, has performed remarkably well. India's e-commerce market has grown at year-on-year rate of 5% with an estimated revenue of $56.6 billion in FY 2021. But going forth to sustain, to ensure that we have a firm e-commerce framework in the country which grows and we are able to sustain the growth that we have recorded in the past as well, what are the kind of hopes and expectations from the budget?
Well, I think you are absolutely right in saying that e-commerce has shown tremendous performance and it has a huge potential. I mean, India is one country which has simply scratched at the surface at the moment. And there is a huge amount of potential which is lying ahead. Mm-hmm. But there are 3 or 4 very critical issues which we need to sort out before that potential really materializes. I think there are issues around data. And one issue that, or rather a couple of issues that come out of data is the issue of data privacy, issue of data localization, and related security. I think this issue is in the boiling pot for a fairly long time now. There has been a lot of consultation on the subject. There is a privacy-related bill which is there under consideration in the parliament. And once that is out, a lot of air around it will clear. But unless that issue is sorted out, we will not be in a position to bring out policies which will help us in the future to move forward. The second area is, again, productization of data. Now, data localization and data privacy have a direct relationship with productization of data into product. As you know, data is a raw input, and data generates products, the soft products, and the hard products as well. Now, if you do not use the data in a manner, or if your producer doesn't get to use the data in a manner that he can produce for the country products which are required for future, then we are simply letting that data go waste. Today, because we haven't come out with a policy or because implementation is not happening, data is flowing as it was, except in cases like finance, for example, where RBI has already issued directions. So therefore, we are not even in a position to productize data, even that data which is in the government, which is being generated by government in the government systems. I think that is an important area to give an impetus to e-commerce. And then there are other areas, for example, the whole dimension of e-commerce policy, where there are a whole lot of other smaller issues. So in my view, an effort was made some years ago to bring out an e-commerce policy. I don't want to comment on the right or wrong of that policy, but that was a good effort. I think we need to take that forward and bring up a policy, because once we do that policy, we will be in a position to build up a strong ecosystem for promoting e-commerce in the manner in which we should.
Absolutely. Mr. Agarwal, what are the concerns of the e-com industry and the critical aspects that Mr. Kher has spoken about? Do you also think the time is ripe to actually have a stricter and much more stronger e-commerce policy framework in the country?
The administration of the e-commerce ecosystem is very important, of course. There is no doubt about that. But what is really the issue is there are very strong voices on every side of every issue that comes up, and that requires a very I would say detailed knowledge or expert knowledge for the authority which is going to take decision on these matters. So I guess this is a field which does require a lot of hard thinking and making our building up some very robust structures which can have the intellectual heft also to be able to actually listen to both sides of the argument and then arrive at the view which is actually right for our country. So I think I'm not an expert on that, but what I can say is even anybody on the outside who is not fully aware of the intricacies of the subject would definitely tend to get confused.
Absolutely. Mr. Navneet, digital technology is the present and the future, and there is immense scope. There is immense potential if we talk about our country. We've seen how it has grown, how India has adapted to this change scenario. But going forth to ensure that because it's going to become a necessity, how do we tap the maximum potential and keeping with the global standards as well?
So let me give you this comfort that being here in Geneva in Switzerland, I can tell you, we are much more progressive on the digital side or e-commerce side, both from the trade point of view as well as domestically, what we are doing. We are much more advanced than most of the European countries here, what I see in Geneva and particularly during pandemic, because these countries have created a whole lot of barriers on their digital trade or e-commerce and not allowing things to come from outside. So the emphasis here in Geneva is to basically, again, have the market access into country like India or some of the other developing countries where they see the potential of huge market. On digital side, what we have done in UPI, that is Unified Payment Interface, and what we have done with the utilization of Aadhaar, I think we need to build up on that and expand our digital ecosystem to further outreach to those people who are still not using these systems, whether it is for the digital services or digital payment point of view. But at the same time, we need to be guarded that when we expand our digital technology, we are giving huge market to the players, and the rules should not be made for the existing players.
Absolutely.
And I will always give this example that the rule making in this case should be more like Android platform, where you should not differentiate between different players working on it, and they should be allowed to innovate and bring their apps to work on that Android platform as a pipeline. So that is the crux in the digital regulation and digital rulemaking. No doubt we need to protect data because everyone is looking at the utilization of data or commercialization of data. So the data utilization, data regulations has to be the crux. And we need to be, again, more, I will say, inward oriented on this sector, because a lot of countries will be pushing us hard for this thing.
And since this is the future, there will be other forms of technology going forth, things like artificial intelligence that will help us grow in the future as well. Time is running out. I'll have to wrap up the discussion with that remark from Mr. Navneet. And thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. It was a pleasure having you on the show. So that's it from us on this budget special edition, where we spoke about trade and commerce, the multiple challenges in this sector, but the kind of growth that it has shown in the year gone by, and the promise it holds for the upcoming financial year and beyond. The expectations of the budget will, of course, we'll have to wait and watch for as to what the finance minister has to promise for trade and commerce sector in her upcoming budget. So with that, it's a wrap on this budget special edition. Thanks very much for your time.